That hurts so bad. All right, we shall begin. My name is Austin Ruse. I'm president of CFAM, the Center for Family and Human Rights. We focus all of our time on mostly lobbying the UN and its delegates to ensure that abortion doesn't become an international human right, that the family's not redefined. We've even participated in a negotiation that led to a very solid definition of gender in international law, which most people don't know about, and the UN bureaucracy ignores. But nonetheless, we have it. CFAM is also active in Washington, D.C., but only on international life and family issues. I'm delighted this month to welcome an old friend of mine, Jay Richards. Jay is now at the Heritage Foundation. He has had a storied career in public policy. He's written a number of books, and I had to get this out and write them down so I could read them off. Jay published something called Money, Greed, and God. He wrote a wonderful book called Eat Fast, Feast, which is, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that. I was honored to read that in manuscript form. The Price of Panic, which was one of the very first books in COVID time, which I thought was quite remarkable. He wrote a book called The Privileged Planet. And I'd love to talk about all of these with Jay. The Human Advantage is another book. The Hobbit Party is another. God and Evolution is yet another. It is quite remarkable. It is, the thing about Jay Richards is that he is among the smartest guys that I know. And he wears his smartness pretty lightly. A lot of people who are, pretty smart wear it kind of heavily and they hit you over the head with it. But Jay doesn't, he's pretty much always in teaching mode, helping people understand things that are actually quite complicated. Also has the great skill of taking complicated things and simplifying them for the likes of me. So Jay, nice to see you.
Yeah, you too, Austin. Thanks so much. I'm glad to be able to do this.
Were you aware, Jay, that there's a good definition of gender in international law?
I am aware of that, but only because my colleague Grace Melton, whom you know,
Yep.
that works, she's sort of our person that works at the UN, had alerted me to that.
Yeah.
That's actually there, and that the reality is a lot of countries in the international space on family issues that the Americans might think are our adversaries actually end up being our allies on questions of marriage and abortion and
Yep.
gender. Basically, everybody who thinks that females are an actual thing in the world, a real thing, and not a social construction, they're our allies on this question. So
it's a funny thing because the two solid mentions of gender in UN fora, the Beijing Women's Conference, it says that gender is to be understood as it has traditionally been understood. And then a few years later, in the negotiations that established the International Criminal Court, the definition is of gender as men and women in the context of society. Having said that, the UN bureaucracy, now these are definitions of the UN General Assembly, the member
Yes.
states meeting together and negotiating. But then the UN bureaucracy does exactly what it wants to, and they say it's a social construct and yada, 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 and all the nonsense. So there's this huge divide between the UN General Assembly, the legislative body, and the bureaucracy. And no single UN member state is powerful enough to correct the UN bureaucracy. They are a power unto themselves, and so it's this permanent divide. But let's talk a little bit about, I wanted to talk a lot today about the gender issue, but I want to you tell everybody where you were prior to Heritage, why you made the switch, and what you're working on now.
Absolutely. So as you graciously listed some of my books, I'm officially, I guess, a philosopher. At least that's what Wikipedia says at the moment, until someone changes it. And I say philosophy allows you to be a parasite on all the other disciplines. And so for a long time, honestly, I was working on economic questions, even though I've written, on, in DC, we put different issues in buckets. And so there's the social issues and the fiscal issues. And I was sort of writing on the fiscal issues. In the last 7 years before I came to Heritage, I was actually on the faculty of the Bush School of Business at Catholic University of America here in DC. But most of my career's really, other than that, been in the think tank world. And I guess I want to focus on issues that I think are really important and that can make a difference. And years ago, watching my friend Ryan Anderson at the Heritage Foundation take on what we're now calling gender ideology, I realized this is a really significant topic. In fact, I think civilization stands or falls on this question, because it's actually a question about whether is there an actual human nature? I mean, you can't have human rights, you can't have human equality if there isn't a human nature. And you can't have humans if you don't have males and females, so that we are both, I think we're created equal in the image of God. So that's what we share. But God has also differentiated us so that there are males and females. And this is something this isn't a sectarian religious belief. It's, it's just as manifest as any kind of other thing you could observe in biology. And the fact that we have an ideology that seeks to deny that in our laws and institutions, I just thought, this is crazy. And I actually said, I wish I could sort of help take that on, because I think it's just a really big deal. But I was perfectly happy at Catholic. And then Ryan, he got a new position as the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. And I had mentioned something about, maybe I would get into this if Ryan ever left the Heritage Foundation and his position opened up. Well, that's actually what happened. And my younger daughter, Ellie, whom she reminded me of that. And so, I applied and ended up here. I mean, it's amazing because Heritage is a kind of general full service conservative think tank. But unlike some other conservative organizations, it hasn't surrendered life and marriage and religious liberty and the gender issue, despite how neuralgic they are. It's a major issue. And so honestly, it's weird because I'm fighting something that in many is a very, very dark force, I think. But I feel privileged to actually be able to do that, actually to get paid to fight. We're both doing that. We're fighting fights that make a difference.
You decided that you would do your best to ruin your reputation and your life prospects.
Absolutely. I've already done that multiple times over. And I could care less if people hate me on social media. Honestly, I've never lost 1 minute of sleep over people saying mean stuff about me. So I don't know if that's in normal society, that's a deficiency, but for fighting unpopular, for unpopular causes, it's adaptive.
Yeah, absolutely. Now,
I know I'm speaking to a kindred spirit on that.
There was an early book on gender that I found very helpful, and that's by Dale O'Leary. Do you remember The Gender Agenda by Dale O'Leary?
I do. Yes, I do, actually. Yeah.
She was so early to this. And another early, very influential book for me was a book by a friend of mine. He's not much of a friend anymore. We used to run around New York together. John Colapinto's book on the John Joan case. I have not been, I've been in touch a little bit with John on tweet, and he's one of these guys that said, whatever happened to you? As I have sort of drifted, into the social conservative, whatever happened to you? But anyway, his book on the John Joan case, I think, is a seminal work for a lot of people. And I've never asked John, I would love to know what he thinks about how his book is now used. I presume you've read the John Joan case by Colapinto.
Now you're talking about the book about the
As Nature
Reimer
Made
brothers?
Him. Yeah, with the book As Nature Made Him by Rolling Stone, Vanity Fair journalist John Colapinto. It was an early exploration of this.
It was. Well, and before it was probably all a partisan question.
That's right.
It was just,
that's right.
It's become a partisan question. I don't know exactly when, but it of course came to the fore. Honestly, I think in the United States, if you look, we had the Obergefell case that came down with the Supreme Court with same-sex marriage. And it felt like 2 weeks later, every mainstream media entity was talking about the transgender issue. But at the moment, it wouldn't have been obvious if somebody asked you 20 years ago. One of the political parties would go all in on helping kids to sterilize themselves when they're still minors, to fix a psychological problem that they have. It's not like it wouldn't have been obvious to me that that's going to be the Democrats rather than the Republicans, right? It's going to gone different ways, but sexual ideology has become so fundamental. I think. I mean, I call it the pelvic left. It's like this cluster
So do
of
I.
sexual issues. You know,
Yeah.
that it trumps everything. So it trumps your concern for the poor. It trumps your concern for women. It is basically whenever there's a kind of conflict between interests, it's the one that wins, and that's what's happened here. I really don't think the average person voting really realizes that, but clearly the ideologues are calling the shots on this, at least
You
in
know,
the
it's
US and
interesting.
certainly in the UN bureaucracy.
When I was writing my book, Fake Science, that looked at the scientific claims of the left and then showed
Yeah.
what the real science shows, one of the things I did was I counted the number of times, I went to the New York Times website and did a word search by year. And I counted the word transgender starting in 1995. In 1995, in the entire year, there were only two. One was in a letter to the editor, and one was, within the context of LGBT, and then it's sort of a few more, 10 years later, and a few more, but almost always in the context of LGBT and not as a standalone term. And then, as you say, in 2015, it went to like 1,000, like overnight, it went to 1,000.
Overnight.
Now, is that because the pelvic left was looking for the next big thing that they could raise money on and advance their cause with?
Mm-hmm. I do think that it was partly that. I mean, the theorists, of course, were thinking this through long term, but the fact that, I think Peter Sprigg notes in the comments that the Caitlyn Jenner thing happened just within a month, and in fact, the Obama administration actually altered some regulatory language, the so-called Section 1557 part of the Affordable Care Act. Immediately, one moved in and wanted to change the definition of sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity almost immediately. And so I think a lot of this had to do with the big organizations that were funding things. So once Obergefell happened, the question would be, okay, what do we give Human Rights Campaign money to do? Well, let's have them focus on the gender ideology question. I don't know that they realized that, in fact, they'd end up creating a conflict within the movement, because if you're a lesbian, presumably you are a woman attracted to other women, and gender ideology actually denies that that distinction. So it ends up being sort of a snake that consumes its own tail in the long run.
Yeah, it's bigoted for a lesbian not to be attracted to a woman with a penis.
Yeah, this is where we are now. It is also what, I mean, the problem is that the jokes sort of write themselves on this stuff, but the reality is that the coalition on this debate in this battle is going to look different than the coalition on life and the coalition on marriage, precisely because of this. We're now at the stage where ideology is denying basic biological reality. And, a lot of people actually have a stake in basic biological reality. And so I think there are some interesting, strange bedfellows on this battle. And I think it's going to be harder for politicians, to sort of handle this long term when they realize that, no, this just doesn't divide as neatly left-right as some of the other things do.
One of the worries with the Dobbs decision, and the worry, kind of flared up last night on my wife's Facebook page. One of the feminist, maybe lesbian allies on the transgender question was quite upset with the Dobbs decision, and on her Facebook page put the home addresses of the 5 Supreme Court justices, and I frankly had not seen that before. Mm-hmm. Are you worried that Dobbs will have a negative effect on this gender coalition? Well, on the other hand, Naomi Wolf wrote a remarkable Substack yesterday on this particular question, and said that the radical feminists had gone way too far. Anyway, go ahead.
Interesting. Okay, because I was actually wondering this as well, and I don't want to name names, but one of the women is very much on the left, that identifies herself as a radical feminist. She's not a lesbian, but a radical feminist, but is also very pro-choice on abortion. She's been very exercised about this,
Yeah.
about the Dobbs decision. But I've been, tracking this, and I've noticed. I honestly think that I'm hoping that many of the people that maybe 2 years ago would have just thought all of us on the social conservative side hate women now realize, no, okay, they might disagree with us on abortion, but we aren't. It's not our hatred of women that causes us to be pro-life, and so I really think it will hold together, because part of it is that we're all adults here, and we realize that there are going to be different things on which we agree and disagree. It's just that it really is it's really a complicated issue. It's complicated for politicians. They don't know how to talk about it. They're happy to talk about sports, I think. They don't really want to talk about gender transition, because it makes them uncomfortable, but they're going to have to do that.
Let's talk a little bit about, as much as you can. You hosted, over the years, you go to a lot of conferences in Washington, D.C., you go to a lot of panels, and you very rarely learn something new. But I went to a private conference that you hosted at the Heritage Foundation now a few months ago, in which I actually learned new things and met new people. Yeah. And it was on gender, and I met some remarkable people and heard some remarkable stories. Insofar as you can and feel comfortable, can you talk about that closed session?
Yeah, absolutely. It was actually, it came about because we did this panel that anyone can watch, and it was a panel with mothers who have had kids affected by gender ideology in public schools. Two of the moms are already out in public and talking about it. A third mom, Abby Martinez from California, had never told her story before. It's a tragic story. As you'll recall, her daughter got taken away from her by Child Protective Services, placed with a radical gender activist who put her on testosterone. This was what the mom, Abby, didn't want to put her teenage daughter on testosterone, and so the state actually took her away from her. So her daughter was on testosterone, heavy doses, for a couple of years. She had already suffered from depression. Guess what? Testosterone didn't help. She spiraled, and she ended up actually committing suicide. So it is an utterly tragic outcome.
It is a dramatic image that someone recounted. Well, the mother recounted that somebody saw her daughter on the train tracks, kneeling in front of the train with her arms out like Christ on the cross, and then was mowed down by the train.
Oh, it's just tragic,
Yeah.
And so that was the event. I just wanted to do an event and realized, well, we've got a few people coming in from out of town, some moms that, what's happening is that there's a growing army of parents whose kids are having to deal with this stuff. And I thought, well, gosh, we're going to have 5 or 6 people here. It was literally that. And I said, let's just try to have a day-long private symposium. Well, we ended up with 45 people for 12 hours, And so the reality is that this is, with the pro-life movement in the United States, we've been fighting it for 50 years. This, in many ways, a lot of people have not even been fighting this 50 weeks yet. But we don't have 50 years, because if a third of our teenagers or young kids get transfixed by this ideology, they could end up sterilized. And so this really would have civilizational effects. And this is, unfortunately, I don't think it's an exaggeration. This is the kinds of numbers we're seeing with young kids that are in public school settings, in which entire friend groups of girls will come out as non-binary or something like that. And so that's why I think, look, we don't have 50 years. We need to fight this now, and we need to fight it, I hope, before the class action lawsuits ended, because unlike abortion, where the primary victim in abortion, the primary victim is not here, right? We're speaking for the victim. In this case, the victims will still be around. The parents will be around, and the kids who's were allowed foolishly to sterilize themselves in many cases, and and change their lives forever, they'll still be around, and they'll be mad. So I do think there's going to be class action lawsuits against these doctors and these gender clinics. I just really like to stop it before that happens.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the interesting guys that was there at the panel was the guy who stands in front of schools with a sandwich board.
Yes.
What is he called?
Billboard Chris. It's Chris
Billboard
Elston.
Chris.
He
Yes.
is terrific. Exactly. And we had him there. And so I mean, he is a Canadian dad who just realized how outrageous this is. And so he quit his job and he raises money. You can donate to him. And he's going all around North America with billboards, and he just stands, he's been doing it at the Pride parades for the last couple of weeks.
And tell the folks what the billboard says.
The board will say something like, definition of a father, someone who protects his daughters from gender ideology, or it might have the definition
or that
of what
children should not have puberty blockers.
Blockers,
yeah.
Children should not have puberty blockers. Stuff like really, really outrageous kinds of statements, and just talks to people one at a time. And he's got a very interesting sense demographically of what's happening in people's heads, because this is kind of like an ethnographic study of North Americans out on the street, and he's doing this every day. It's really quite extraordinary. But I honestly think that the army that's going to win this is going to be parents who got lit up because either their kids' friends or their children themselves got sucked into this thing. And I really don't think the other side has quite reckoned with that yet, that they're going to have tens of thousands of parents who are instinctually opposed to them. And these gender ideologues, frankly, these groomers in school settings, I don't think they quite realize what they're doing. I honestly think that they have drastically overplayed their hand. And I think probably the smart people on the other side, the smart political consultants, realize that, but don't quite know how to slow this thing down.
One of the interesting interactions at that conference was with the gentleman from the state of Texas over the question of whether you investigate parents who allow this to happen. And the pushback in the room was so interesting. And it actually changed my thinking on this, because I was thinking that, oh, golly, all these parents are going along with this and they think it's all groovy and they're in favor of it. But as a matter of fact, for many parents, it's a traumatic experience that they try to help their children through. There was a woman there who I talked to extensively. I don't know if I could reveal her name, but her daughter at this moment is going through this.
That's right.
And this woman is not the enemy. And honestly, I thought that they were. So my eyes were open. This is one of the new things that I learned in this conference.
That's exactly right. I mean, what you see, I would say there are two classes of parents. The vast majority of parents in this thing are blindsided by it. They go to their school counselor, they go to their pediatrician, who tells them, more often than not, these transition procedures are the only way to prevent your child from committing suicide. So do you want a live daughter or a dead son? This is the line over and over. And so if you're a parent, the worst possible outcome is a child suicide. And so you're willing to do a lot to avoid that. And so you're kind of doing what you're told. All the authority figures that you trust are telling you this. And so unless they happen to be real researchers that can go online and find out the truth, they're just following whatever the officials are telling them. Now, there's a small percentage of parents, and you can see them on libs of TikTok, whom we could call sort of, I joke, they're the munchie moms. It's sort of Munchausen by proxy syndrome. They almost seem like they're excited in recruiting their children to this thing. And I really do think in some cases that's true, that it gives them social status, just as for some young teenagers, you're the weird kid in class, they come out as trans or non-binary, and all of a sudden all the institutions of their school orient toward serving them. In the same way, being a parent of just a white, blonde 11-year-old girl, right? That's just, sort of standard issue. There's nothing to that, but if you've got a trans kid, that gives you social status. And so that is a weird thing. And I do think that's a problem, but I think generally state legislators should not optimize laws to root out those strange few parents. They need to take account of the fact that most parents have been blindsided. What they need to do is go after the doctors and the clinicians and the counselors who are either polluting kids' minds or their bodies. They're the primary culprits. And I think that the state has a role to play in this. And I think that's where they should focus their attention, and also empower, like the state of Arkansas and the SAFE Act, empower the parents and empower the kids with a private right of action. So the SAFE Act in Arkansas, for instance, kids, if I get the details right, let's say you get gender transition procedures done starting when you're 16, and when you're 18, you get a double mastectomy. Well, you can sue. You've got a right, the sort of statute of limitations for suing that doctor that did that extends for 30 years, right? So if you're a doctor, you know, okay, this child that I'm operating on, she may sue me in 25 years. That changes the incentive structure, I think, just the way we want it to be changed.
Yeah. One of the gentlemen that was there was one of your colleagues at Heritage, Jay Green. Tell us who Jay Green is and what he has worked on in the past, and then we'll talk about. He was red pilled at that meeting.
Yes, he was red pilled. And so Jay is in our Center for Education Policy. And so Heritage has a policy shop. They're down the hall here from me. And he was a distinguished professor at the University of Arkansas for decades, not involved in this issue, didn't really know much about it. He's been interested in school choice and thought school choice was something that could really help people.
I want to digress before I forget about it. One of the really big surprises for me in that room was how all of these people were involved in school choice. This is a movement that is utterly foreign to me. And how did all of these school choice people segue into this issue? I couldn't figure that out. Let's digress on that for a minute.
That's a really good point.
Go back to Jesse Green.
It's a great point, Austin. And so this is something that I happen to notice being in the policy space, is that a lot of, school choice, like if you were in the marriage debate, right, you wouldn't think, let's contact the school choice people to help us with this. You wouldn't think, right? And it's not partisan in that same sort of way. But a lot of school choice people have realized that what's activating parents right now is critical race theory and gender ideology. That's what's activating people. And so a lot of school choice people have started looking and realized actually this and the question of parents' rights, that's what we should really be talking about. We've spent 20 years trying to tell people that school choice will help poor kids in the inner city, which it would, but not saying actually you need to be able to protect your children from the toxic ideology. And so several school choice organizations have now realized, oh, this is a major issue we need to focus on. So that's happened. You've also got school choice people who frankly are parents and they have kids who are exposed to this. And so that's what's an amazing thing. Just as the coalition around this is different than it was.
It's very different. Well, the other thing that came up with regard to school choice was a number of people there said, we spent so many years in the school choice movement and it has been taken over by the left.
Yes.
So our concerns are no longer really being met in that movement.
That's right. That's right. And that was just as on the libertarian world, there's a kind of libertarian right and a libertarian left. And so cultural left has taken over some of these organizations. Others have now realized, in fact, this is Heritage's position, is that actually the way you win the school choice debate is talking about the cultural issues, because that's what most parents are actually concerned about. And so there were lots of school choice people, and that was Jay. So Jay's just a colleague here. He and I actually started about the same time at Heritage. We even had a reception for the two Jays when we started, but he didn't really know anything about this, but he's a really smart quant guy. He's got a PhD from Harvard in political science. And he knows his statistics. I mean, he is really good at this. He's not just pretending. I mean, he really knows it. And so he just said, oh, that sounds like an interesting conference. Can I sit in? I said, oh, sure. Yeah. So he joined us for the day. And as you said, he was red pilled when he heard this argument that supposedly the science shows that these gender transition procedures, puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones in particular, are reduce suicides or reduce suicidal ideation in kids. So in other words, it's a really good treatment for that. And he thought, oh, well, I'll just look at the studies and see what that looks like. Well, when he said that, my heart leaped, because I happen to know that there's about 3 studies, and 2 by the same guy and the other by an ideological group. And they're just, I would say the nicest thing that could be said is that they are extremely weak, if not fundamentally flawed in terms of sort of proving the point. And so he spent the next 3 months doing a statistical analysis of these research, developed a much better statistical methodology for testing this, and then realized, wait, there's actually a natural experiment that we can run. We don't have a randomized controlled trial. Nobody has that. But he said, what's funny is that in some states, kids can get access to these treatments without parents' permission. And in other states, to get it, they're going to get parents' permission. So we've got this, everything's sort of the same, but we've got these two variables. And so he controlled for a bunch of other stuff and said, okay, so let's see what happens in those states with suicides. And he noticed that there's nothing interesting that happens. There's no divergence between these two sets of states until about 2010, basically when this stuff really went online. And then you get a divergence. So it turns out that it's exactly the opposite of what everybody's told. States where kids have access to this, like easier access to puberty blocking drugs and cross-sex hormones, have a higher rates of suicide among teenagers. So it's exactly the opposite. And I was glad that it didn't get ignored. Jack Turbin, the author of two of these papers, went after Jay online. Jesse Singal has gone after him. And Jesse's a smart guy. He's kind of a left-wing blogger that's been critical of gender ideology, but he just simply doesn't know what he's talking about on this stuff. And so Jay anticipated all of their objections and has really decisively responded to them. But I mean, the key point is that no one should believe this claim that the science shows that these treatments reduce suicide in teenagers. There's no evidence of that. In fact, if anything, there's some evidence that it's the other way around.
Jesse Signal, in his lengthy Substack on this paper, he went after the studies that say that there is conclusive evidence that taking puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones reduces suicidal ideation. But he said that Jay Green went too far and said that it's flipped and that there's less suicide. So he's half good on this.
Yeah, he's half good, and that's why and that's why Jay responded to him. Jay didn't respond to every Twitter troll, but he responded to Jack Turbin and he responded to Jesse Singal because they seem to be open. One, he had to respond to the guy he was critiquing, and then also, Singal is pretty good on this, but I think he realized, I don't want to, he has kind of liberal credentials to maintain, and so I don't know that he wanted to. It's like, oh no, I can't seem to be agreeing with the Heritage Foundation on this, even though he doesn't actually have any good objections.
Somebody in the comment boxes wants to know, what does red pill mean?
Oh gosh, yeah, that is a digression. So this is from the original Matrix movie with Keanu Reeves, in which the whole world is actually in this matrix, and you think you're living life, but it's actually just a script that's playing, and there's this big computerized kind of hive mind that is drawing energy off of human bodies and the heat of the body. And so then they're actually controlling what you see, and we're all actually just these bodies in vats, imagining we're living our lives, viewing this artificial matrix. And so there's rebels that can pull you out of it. And so the red pill, basically, if somebody is pulled out of it and they realize, okay, this is all an illusion, they can decide, do you want to go back and keep living the illusion or not? And the red pill is where you take it if you don't want to live the illusion anymore. That's the red pill. And so getting red pilled means being awakened to something that you thought made perfect sense. And then once you see it, you can't unsee it. You can just never kind of go back to your naive way of thinking again.
And what is being black-pilled?
Black-pilled is when you just don't believe anything. Essentially, you're just utterly skeptical. And so I tell people, I don't want to black-pill you. I don't want you, because if people get too depressed, they think, well, even your story about the illusion being an illusion is an illusion, right? And so this is the danger. I've seen this on the right for a long time, is that sort of, you just kind of become nihilistic because you don't think.
It's funny. I feel I'm verging on black-pilled, because anybody that says they're an expert, it's like I automatically don't believe them.
No, exactly. This is me. This is the black pill, and this is me every day, right? Yeah. No, we can make a difference.
I haven't given up, but I still.
You keep fighting. Absolutely. Yes.
So there was also a guy there who was talking about something I'd never heard of, and I can't remember the guy's name. He was from AEI, and there's some educational theory that he was talking about. What is this theory, and what? Tell me about this.
It's social emotional learning, and it's a long, complicated, it's SEL. So anybody that wants to know can Google this. And so social emotional learning, I don't want to go into the whole details because it's not like by itself the idea that you would help kids obviously you want to help kids grow emotionally, right? And socially, those are relevant skills. And so you'd want to take account of that. But unfortunately, social emotional learning has become a vehicle for introducing these really toxic ideas to young kids. And so rather than, old timey days where you teach kids, the Latin endings, or you have them memorize history dates. Instead, what you do is you do exercises to help kids figure out, okay, what would be the nice thing to do? What would be the compassionate thing to do? And you sort of role play different kind of emotional and social situations. And what you do is you teach kids to be what they understand as empathetic, so that their choices about what they say and what they do is based, if mostly, if not entirely, on how they think other people will feel. Right. And so as opposed to telling them the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. Right. And so you got to get kids in that mode. And then when you introduce critical race theory, right, well, there's lots of sad race stories that you can actually tell kids, and they're not going to be sort of critical imbibers of it. And then gender ideology, it all gets introduced, and it gets sort of under their critical and rational faculties. And so this colleague that you were mentioning, he's really, really worried about social emotional learning and thinks, look, that's sort of the root. It's not the cause of this, but it's a vehicle, at least in public schools, for a lot of these toxic ideologies.
I thought he was incredibly impressive. What is his name?
His name is Max Eden, actually. He's a really good guy. He's working on a book on this. And yeah, he's really good.
That was that was just one of the fascinating things about this meeting, is it drew together, well, I just say it again, people I'd never heard of, people I didn't know, issues that I wasn't aware of. I mean, new stuff.
Yeah.
There was this woman, Trinity Justice. That is such a made-up name.
Tiffany Justice.
Tiffany Justice, right?
Yes. It's a real name. It's her name. Yeah, she is the co-founder of Moms for Liberty. Again, another group that didn't exist 2 years ago. They now have 80,000 members and over 120 chapters around the country. Either Vanity Fair or The Atlantic or someone like that, or New York Magazine, had a major story on them a few weeks ago and said Moms for Liberty is going to make school board elections a nightmare around the country, which is, that's great, right? But really, it was the COVID thing. It was, teachers unions insisting that first graders can't go back to school, right? As if we all can't look at the numbers on COVID. And so that was sort of the thing that alerted them. It was that and the critical race theory, in which kids were being taught to hate each other.
And then trends.
Right? And then all of a sudden, yeah. And so now they're down in the weeds on this stuff. But this is where a lot of the action is going to be. I mean, I'm at the Heritage Foundation. We focus a lot here on the Capitol. We are focusing more now on states, but a lot of the action on this issue is going to happen at the school boards. And that's it. People have to learn how to interact with school boards.
There's an influential essay that I think is recent by a guy named Nate Hochman, who's a fellow at National Review. It ran in the New York Times, in which he made some claims which I think are just ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And one is that there is a divide between the old culture warriors who are motivated by religion and the new culture warriors who are, I don't want to say pagan, but not religious. And he said that the new culture warriors who are making all this amazing progress at the school boards are, on CRT primarily, are these new kinds of social conservatives. And I just think that is false, because when my wife was going down, she didn't go down to the school board on CRT, but it's the same people on CRT that are there on trends, and they're all motivated by religious faith. Did you accept this distinction of Nate Hochman?
I think that, and it's actually a really interesting piece, and I do think he's observing something. I don't buy that simple kind of distinction. Yeah. It's sort of like in 2010, remember when the Tea Party cropped up? The claim was that was all just a bunch of fiscal conservatives and social conservatism was dead. Right. And then you went and go to the Tea Party. It's like, everybody here's Southern Baptists, so these seem to be the same folks, And so I think in this case, I think what he's detecting is that the culture wars don't slot simply into the media template. And so you get people like we had at our meeting, right, which are not, traditional social conservatives. Some of them are not even religious, but they're absolutely on fire on this issue. It doesn't mean, though, that people with religious concerns aren't part of the coalition. They are. It's just that, if anything, I think the coalition is becoming more diverse as the sexual left gets more radical. I think that's what he's sort of detecting, but it's not a fundamentally new thing. If you thought boys and girls existed, in 1980, you're still a part of this coalition in 2022.
Yeah. It's one of the unfortunate things. We look around for the kinds of religious right spokesmen that we had in the old days, and
Yeah.
there really aren't a lot of them.
No.
It's like, I remember when what's his name from the Christian Coalition was on television a lot, and he was fantastic. But it's like we were eventually embarrassed by some of them.
Some of them, yeah. I mean, the reality is that there were some maybe sort of overweight televangelists, let's say, just to kind of keep it generic, which they were sort of, from the media's perspective, the secular media likes people like that, they kind of fulfill a stereotype, and they will elevate those people. But whereas they're genuinely terrified, I think, of Tiffany Justice and Moms for Liberty, because they don't. It's like they're not central casting. It's like, no, we thought that moms in suburbs were all in for Obama. What's happening here? And so I think that genuinely worries them.
The other thing that happened, and I swear I saw this happen in the course of 5 days back during the marriage debate. On a Monday, Tony Perkins of Family Research Council, a tub-thumping evangelical lovely guy, important. On a Monday, he was arguing from scripture with regard to marriage. And then by the end of the week, he was doing the Robbie George, sociology shows us that children need a mom and a dad. And it's like that switch from, citing scripture or encyclicals or whatever to going strictly into social science and science and things like that. So that evangelicals started talking a new kind of talk.
So I mean, we're Catholic, and so we inherited the natural law tradition, and so we're more accustomed to doing that. And I do think Protestants were more accustomed to making arguments directly from scripture. I mean, I think, look, Martin Luther King, he quoted scripture too, and so I think there's a way to do that. I think scripture is a part of our cultural inheritance. At the same time, you want to make arguments that are based on premises that your audience agrees with. And so if you're wanting to sort of make the case for marriage to people that aren't Christians, it makes sense that you're not going to cite scripture. It doesn't follow that there's not a biblical or a scriptural or theological argument for something. It's just that there are also other grounds for these positions. And it's like abortion, right? I mean, as Ryan Anderson often says, look, laws prohibiting abortion are no more and no less religious than laws prohibiting murder or rape, right? I mean, there's, of course, theological justifications for it, but there are also natural law justifications. And if we're going to have laws, there's going to be an implicit kind of moral framework that we bring to that.
Let's look at a couple of questions on the chat. Here, I've got a Q&A here. Tess Hackett says, I'm an Australian mom of an ROGD child. What is that?
That's rapid onset gender dysphoria.
I hate acronyms with a passion. Who transitioned in 2017. Are you aware of the situation in Australia and around the world in regards to children and their ability to access hormones and the associated removal of parental rights? It's my understanding that some countries are better than we are. Great Britain, for instance, France, for instance. Do you know the situation in those two countries?
I do. And so I would say it's better in the UK because frankly, they have fewer choices, and so they have a socialized system, and so that's strange. But if they're much slower, and so I think there's really this one Tavistock clinic that does the gender clinic in the UK, and so it's just harder to get. Whereas in the US, there are over 100 gender clinics, and close to 300 Planned Parenthoods are now dispensing cross-sex hormones, and so there's one of these things where market can be a blessing, but it's also more efficient at delivering bad stuff too, and so that's the kind of irony. What happened is that the UK and the Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, some of these Northern European countries started doing this before we did. But they've also taken their foot off the accelerator more quickly. So the UK is now hesitating. Finland and Sweden not right-wing religious theocracies, have both having second thoughts about this. And it's because they're a little farther along and are just looking at the statistics and say, look, doing this doesn't ultimately seem to actually help the patients. The idea was that this would help them to be comfortable with their bodies. It turns out that there's a lot of stuff that's just not fixed by, there's always this question, okay, if somebody has a discordant sense of their gender or their sex and it's discordant with their bodies, should we try to help them become comfortable with their bodies, or should we change their bodies so that it matches this perception? That's the argument on the other side, is that we should do that. We don't say that for anything else. We wouldn't do that for bulimia or for anorexia. And yet, why do we do it here? Well, again, it's because this ideology has overridden what would otherwise be our capacity for reading basic statistics in science journals.
Our friend Peter Sprigg, who I've known for years and years, highly respect, he intervenes. He says, well, I'm a Baptist minister, but I always relied on kids need a mom and a dad argument when I was at FRC. Smiley face.
Yes, exactly. And it's not like, people often will say that, well, Protestants don't believe in the natural law, or it's not really true. It's just that, you are accustomed to certain ways of arguing. And so I think the reality is the people involved, Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, whatever, that are involved in these social issues are remarkably well informed and, skilled practitioners of what they do. What's happened is that we have developed our arguments for life and for marriage. The gender stuff, because it's so protean, I mean, frankly, the terms change every 6 weeks. We're just still trying to figure out, okay, what are the kind of best arguments to make it a public square with people that are inclined not to agree with us.
Yeah. So are you working on a book on this, Jay?
I am. So there's so many good books on this that I promised myself never to write a book that has already been written. So Ryan's When Harry Became Sally, it's been written. It's still good. It's still up to date. Material Girls by Kathleen Stock, who is a feminist lesbian philosopher in the UK, is exquisite. Highly recommend it. Trans by Helen Joyce at The Economist. Again, she's on the left, is really good. The book that's forming in my head is something called Anti-Human, and it combines transhumanism, posthumanism, and transgenderism. So it's and the World Economic Forum, because of course you got to have a Bond villain. So as you know, I've been interested in some of this stuff, and so that's it's kind of tying all this stuff together. That's what I think I'll probably do. But at the moment, I'm down in the fight and happy to be so.
Somebody points out that Abigail Schreier's book is also quite good.
Yes, it's terrific right here.
Do you see anything in the comment boxes that you'd like to comment on here? Yeah,
there have been a couple of things about the term sex and gender. Maybe I'll just mention a little bit, because this is tricky. And so I went and I've looked this up. I've looked up the etymology of gender, because it's common to say, well, sex refers to biology and gender is a term we use in language, like, masculine, feminine ending. Or neuter ending, say in German or in Spanish or in English. And that's true. That, like, most of us 30 years ago, when you heard gender, you were accustomed to hearing about it in language context. But gender has for hundreds of years actually been a sort of polite synonym for biological sex. So if you don't want to say sex, you say gender. And so it's not like it was unheard of. It was also sometimes treated as a synonym for sex. Here's what happened, though, is that sometime about 30 years ago, the word sex basically dropped out. So we still use the word for the sex act, but we don't use it much to refer to the male-female binary. And so even on doctors' forms now, you'll often get gender rather than sex. And so that had to happen. Something that's a kind of a secondary synonym comes in as a replacement. So we get rid of sex, which has the more biological resonances, right? And once we're used to that, gender ideology comes in and starts using the word gender to refer to gender identity, which is an internal and subjective state of mind, independent of your body. And that's what's happened. So in gender ideology, they're not just saying, well, there's your biological sex and there's your gender. No, gender identity replaces biological sex. And so they're not willing to countenance the category biological sex at all. And so that sounds radical to people when they first hear it. They think, that's crazy. Surely people recognize that, there's chromosomes and gametes. No, they'll say, well, those exist, but that's not ultimately what gives us our identity. Our identity is this gender identity, which is an entirely subjective thing, independent of our bodies. And it's only that premise that allows the crazy kind of stuff to happen, like males competing against females in college girls sports.
Have you read, there's a great paper in defense of the word gender by Sister Prudence Allen.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, I've got her trilogy over here. And so that's why now I can tell you, I helped, if you're talking to legislators and they're trying to figure out what to do with language in bills, maybe just dropping the word gender at this point because, it's so squishy, but it's still a perfectly fine word. It has a history. It's connected to the English word genealogy and genus. It actually is anchored in this idea of reproduction. And in fact, two terrific books, one by Abigail Favale, who I had here at Heritage a month ago, and then John Grabowski at Catholic University. Both of their new books have the word gender in it. It's The Unraveling of Gender is John Grabowski's, and The Genesis of Gender by Abigail Favale. Those are both terrific philosophical, theological treatments of this topic.
Have they been maintained on Amazon and other?
Oh, good question. So as of yesterday, The Genesis of Gender, it's an Ignatius book, so it's still there. But Tan Books published John Grabowski's book, and they decided not to even try to sell it. Yeah, and so you're a Tan author, and so they were just afraid that would, there would be some woke employee would notice this book, and then they'd go look at the whole Tan catalog. So they just thought, better. Okay, so it's a little frustrating because but it's a great book, but you need to buy it from somebody else or from the Tan website directly.
So what is next in your world? What are you working on? What's happening next?
What's happening right now is the Title IX ruling. So the Title IX is part of it was an amendment to the Civil Rights Act that basically has to do with prohibiting discrimination against women. That's what Title IX is. And under President Trump and Betsy DeVos, there were great things done at the regulatory level, so the agency level, having to do with regulations on Title IX. The Biden administration right away told us that they want any references to sex and to sex discrimination to include sexual orientation and gender identity. And so they're in the process. They just dropped a draft of a new Title IX regulation, or can think of it as an amendment to a regulation. It's over 700 pages long. So several of us are down in the weeds on that. But, the worry is that, so if sex discrimination is the same as gender identity discrimination, then a male that's not allowed to compete against females in girls' sports could say that his constitutional rights have been violated, when in fact it's the women's rights that have been violated. The reason we have separate female sports in high school and college is because we recognize there's an innate difference for certain purposes between males and females. And if girls and women are going to have a fair shot in athletics, they should be able to have separate athletics separate from males. And so, look, if males can just say, well, I identify as a woman, so now I get to compete against the women, we've just destroyed the very reason we have sex segregated sports to begin with. There's no reason to have that. And so they'll just be dissolved and women will lose out on all the accolades at the top.
My wife is very smart on all of these things, and she's been, since before this became popular, she was going down to the Fairfax County School Board and talking about the transgender policies and things like that. And she believes that we have to, in terms of messaging, continue to hang the albatross of trans upon the rest of the alphabet LGB.
Yeah.
And in writing my book, Fake Science, I ran across a number of homosexual authors who did not like the T's and did not like the idea that an effeminate boy is no longer suggested, which I think is evil, that he may be gay. Yeah, he's now suggested that he's a girl, and the gay authors say, golly, let him grow up to be a gay man or a gay woman. And so Kathy is quite content to say, let's only talk about the T, and that will that will latch on to the rest of the L, the G, and the B. I, however, think that we still need to be talking about those other categories individually. Sexual orientation, Recently I've written a number of columns talking about certain conservative gay authors who seem to
Yeah,
be replacing Christians
right.
in the conservative coalition, Douglas Murray being one, Jamie
Yep.
Kirk's being another. Do you think that we should simply stop talking about the gay issue?
I don't think we should stop talking about it. I mean, if you're a social conservative that believes, as I do, that marriage is a social institution designed to protect and to put guardrails around this unique relationship of a male and a female who, in a certain, it's only a male and a female coming together that can bear children, and that's what a marriage and a family is. That's a truth, right? Now, it may be that there's not, as a policy matter, it may be that, okay, it's not clear how we're going to handle that right now. At the same time, I do think it's important to recognize that the trans issue is different, not just in degree, but in kind, because it's really, in some ways, it's kind of like the gay rights issue was sort of a secular modernist theory, whereas now we're in secular postmodernism with the trans stuff, and it's
Mhm.
really, really, really deranged. And so, and it is a different issue because, Douglas Murray doesn't deny biology. He does deny some other moral truths, but he doesn't deny that. And I honestly, the fact that there are some reasonably conservative gays like him, right, that shows you just how interesting and how complex the field is now, that it doesn't kind of slice up the way it did in 1980. And I'm fine with that. And if anybody asks me, my views on marriage are still exactly the same. But I do think gender ideology does represent a danger that we've not seen before, because it directly, I mean, it's the first time we've gotten a political movement that directly sterilizes children. I mean,
Well,
and what do you do after that? I don't know. What's the encore?
yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, you're exactly right about that. You're exactly right about that. Our hour is just about up. So let me just thank everybody that dialed in. There's a lot of comments that we can't get to, people telling their stories from around the country and around the world. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. This will be up on YouTube sometime soon. My people will put it up. I don't know when. There were a number of books that were mentioned, and I'm hoping that Rebecca or somebody on my team will put these in the chat. So it's just left to me to thank my old friend, Jay Richards, for joining us today for a really insightful and helpful conversation on a very complex issue. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Austin. Great to be with you.
Goodbye, everybody.